Good day, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to one of our very first Security Boulevard webinars. For those of you who generally join in on our DevOps.com webinar, may not be aware, about 3 months ago, we launched another site called Security Boulevard that really focuses on the cybersecurity world with a special emphasis on the intersection of DevOps and security, as we call it, DevSecOps. So this is our first webinar, I think, under the Security Boulevard banner. And as it should be, there's a strong crossover here between DevOps and security. Today's webinar is sponsored by our friends at CA Technologies and Veracode, and it's accelerating the move to the dev use case. Before we begin, just real quick, if you've never used GoToWebinar Control Panel, there is a section here for questions. We have set aside time for questions today. We would really appreciate it if, rather than waiting till the end to ask your question, if you would type it into the question section as it pops into your head. This way we know it's there. We can queue it up and make sure that your question gets answered. If for some reason we have so many questions that we can't answer them all, we also have a written record of it, and we could ask our panelist today, Austin Britt, to get to your answers offline as well. In addition to the question section, we also have a chat section on your webinar control panel. Here at Security Boulevard, we use the chat section if you are having technical difficulties. Audio's not working, slides aren't progressing. Let us know in the chat section. We have engineers standing by who'll try to help you with your problem. So with that being said, though, let us now turn into what I think is going to be a great webinar. As I said, it is sponsored by our friends at Veracode, CA Technologies, and it's accelerating the move to the dev use case. Our panelist today is Austin Britt, Solutions Architect and Team Lead over at Veracode. Let me give you a little background on Austin. If we can go to the next slide, please. Yes. Well, maybe we won't go to the next slide. There we go. Next slide. So Austin, who I might also add, is battling a cold today, so he's a real trooper for being on it, and appreciate it, Austin. Austin's a former security program manager, has managed Fortune 100 application security programs. You could read it in here. He's been with Veracode since 2012, a member of OWASP and Solutions Architect. Austin, hopefully you're feeling better, and welcome to our webinar.
Alan, thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction there. And unfortunately, the timing of the cold is never predictable, but, feeling on the up and up here. So thanks again.
All right, man. The pros play with pain. Do it.
That's right. That's right. So with that being said, Alan, as I mentioned, appreciate the introduction here. Just want to provide a quick agenda in terms of what we're going to touch on today. So first thing I'm going to do is kind of give a foundation of what is DevOps, how does security fit into DevOps, and then we'll talk through what are some of those principles to securing DevOps as part of that work stream. So in order to kind of set the groundwork here, right, it's important to understand where we came from, right, how development methodologies kind of evolved over time. And the first development methodology that kind of went to market was waterfall, right? And what happens within waterfall? Each functional group was kind of siloed, right? You had a product owner who built out a list of requirements, then took that list, kicked it over to development walked through that list of requirements, actually built the code to support those requirements. Once that code is built, being thrown over the wall to quality assurance where they're conducting their testing. Typically within waterfall development methodologies, security will take place within the quality assurance space. And then from there, once the testing is done, it's been validated from a security perspective, validated from a functional perspective. That code base was then kicked over the wall to operations to run. So essentially what ends up happening here, right, it becomes like a game of telephone where the business intent of the application is kind of lost in the process of the development methodology. The understanding of how the application works and what is the functional requirements of that solution gets lost in the process as well, as it's really siloed within development and QA. And then how is the application actually operate in a runtime environment really stands with the operations team. So the original intent of the application from the product owner may be drastically different than what is actually running into production. So it creates a lot of rework and concerns for a development organization. So then came Agile, right? So what we did is we consolidated the planning phase, the development, and the QA. Typically, again, security is kind of embedded as the stopgap between those three teams before it's kicked over to operations. So again, security testing later on in the process from an Agile development workflow perspective. This allowed teams to be consolidated. Ops team is still running the application with the knowledge and visibility of what they have once it's actually kicked over to run in a runtime environment. So what does DevOps look to do? DevOps looks to operationalize all of this, create some sense of continuity, put the product owner, development, QA, operations folks all in the same room. And in some cases, the product owner could be a developer. And in some cases, an operations person could be on the development team or part of the quality assurance testing processes as well. So it's not just having about individuals within the same team. It's about having the functional capabilities and the functional skills within one team. So in order to understand DevOps, right, we need to first understand Agile in a little bit more detail. So for me, this graphic is fantastic for kind of building out how Agile came about, one, and two, what are the requirements in terms of making it as efficient as possible. So looking at the workflow here, you have a product owner, builds out a set of requirements, creates that backlog, goes through that backlog and prioritizes what is most important to the business, what is most important to that solution for impacting revenue needs for that particular business. And then we take that backlog and we sit down with stakeholders, whether it's in the development organization, with the product owner to determine what are we going to do in the next upcoming sprint. And that sprint time frame can vary, right? It can be 1 week, it can be 2 weeks, it can be a month, it can be a year, really situationally dependent upon kind of the culture and the setup of that particular organization. So within that context of that sprint, we have all the stakeholders in the same room. As part of that planning phase to determine what are we going to accomplish in this sprint. Once we do that, we iterate through that sprint to determine what we're going to accomplish. So in the context of a sprint, we're going to have a daily stand-up. This is where all the people who are working on that particular solution are going to understand what is going to be done today, what did they do yesterday, and what roadblocks are in place. And this is really where your Scrum Master becomes so valuable. If you have a Scrum Master that can remove those roadblocks, allow those development operations folks to move faster, it becomes much more beneficial for the teams to execute on their jobs. Within the context of that sprint, it's important that we consistently track the progress with that sprint. So whether that's tracking it electronically through various boards, various KPIs, various metrics, it's important to have that information so that when we go through, we conduct the work and we actually finish a deployable artifact or finish a solution to be pushed into a runtime environment, we can take a look back retrospectively to determine what did we do well, what didn't we do well. And obviously this is a main component of Agile and DevOps, as a matter of fact, is that the concept of continuous improvement. If we're continuously improving, we're becoming more efficient, we're allowing our product to get to market faster, ultimately with the end goal of increasing productivity and profitability for the organization. So as part of that retrospective, right, once a solution is in a runtime environment, where does security come into play? Typically what happens in a number of the organizations that I work with is that security is kind of out on the outside looking in. So development team went through their iterations within the context of the sprint, created a single solution for a deployable artifact. They push it into a runtime environment, and then security steps in and says, wait a minute, what about the risk exposure of that particular artifact? What are we doing to test it, and what exposure do we have? So what's the problem here, right? Security is coming in too late to the game. It's far too late. Maybe they come in and say, hey, we found a list of 100 flaws. I need you to fix all those findings before you can give the thumbs up to move into production. Development comes back and says, you know what, I understand you have 100 flaws. Let's focus in on the top priority issues. So what do? We go through, we prioritize those top 5 to 10 issues that security is most concerned about. We get those fixed. We delay the timeline for delivery. And then what happens to those other 90, 95 issues that were identified? Those end up being pushed to a technical backlog, may be ignored for some time, or development teams may be incentivized later in the year to retroactively go back and clean up that technical backlog. So the problem here is, right, it's too little too late. Development security end up kind of bartering for budget, time, resources. Development's incentivized to move quickly. Security is incentivized to keep the risk reduced. So as part of DevOps, we have this concept of CI/CD. And within CI/CD, continuous integration and continuous delivery, the main goal is to make sure that we're getting innovation into market as fast as possible while maintaining stability. It's important that as part of this process, right, that we can streamline testing of the software that we're building, executing, and kind of working through that backlog, but also automate the deployment process. So once a particular artifact is ready to be released, maybe it's pushing it in an automated fashion to a testing environment, a QA environment, staging environment, as well as replicating that artifact to a production environment. A lot of common tools that we see our customers kind of using in this space. Jenkins is definitely a very popular tool that I see a lot of my customers are leveraging. VSTS, or Visual Studio Team Services on the Microsoft side of the house, Hudson, Circle CI. There's a number of solutions in this space that can help organizations to not only automate the integration process as part of the testing to understand, the functional requirements of a piece of software, but also the delivery process, automating those environments, the creation of those environments, and then the deployment of those artifacts into those environments. With CI/CD, it's also important to understand that there's underlying supporting technologies in these work streams, including those automated builds I talked about, verification of code changes. One thing that we're seeing more and more common in the industry lately is containerization. So essentially taking a deployable artifact, a binary, a conglomerate of code, packaging that in a container, which includes operating system configurations, which includes network configurations. It can include a number of different configurations on how that piece of software interacts with the overall technology stack. So that is becoming increasingly more popular, allowing for kind of scalability across an organization. So in the event a change needs to be done at a code level, right, packaged up into that new container, that container gets automatically deployed to all the various app servers or locations where that particular solution is running. Another important piece to kind of highlight as a technology underlying CI/CD is microservices. So microservices, just smaller, more manageable code that allows for interoperability across an organization. So with those microservices, one of the examples I like to use is, let's say an organization decides to standardize on a authentication mechanism within their company. Once that particular service is kind of built up, it can be called by a number of different applications that are requiring authentication or logging functionality into that application accordingly. Again, allowing for APIs and web services to connect to that system makes it much more scalable, makes it much more agile for teams to interact with that particular service. As we think about defining DevOps, great quote from Nathan Harvey at Chef, really kind of defines DevOps as a cultural change. So it's an organizational-wide change. As you think about the different stakeholders, the different functional groups within an organization, how you impact and how you change, how you think about your day-to-day processes are going to drastically change upon the introduction of DevOps processes. I think about it from my perspective. So I'm a solutions architect, and I work with organizations to determine how our solution could potentially help their organization reduce risk, identify the risk, and take action accordingly to implement educational tools and best practices from a security perspective, regardless of the development methodologies that's kind of being implemented. So from my perspective, if my organization is implementing DevOps and our solution is changing, say on a weekly basis as an example, it's important from a sales perspective that not only do I understand the changes to the product, but I'm communicating those changes in a proper manner to my prospective customers and my current customers to ensure that they're realizing the most value of the product. Additionally, there's the possibility, right, I could go out and position a product that no longer exists because I'm not keeping pace with what the engineering DevOps organization is doing internally, where the functionality that they have built is already surpassed what I'm positioning to my current customers. If you think about it from a services or a support standpoint, maybe there's documentation that's out of date. Maybe we introduce some functionality today that's going to be released tomorrow. However, the documentation isn't necessarily keeping pace with that level of innovation. Also think about it from a marketing standpoint. As we're reaching out to prospective clients or organizations looking to take our software and sell it into those companies, if our marketing campaigns are not aligned with the cultural changes that DevOps has introduced, it becomes more and more difficult to market to those organizations we ultimately want to work with. So what's the end goal of DevOps, right? And the first thing is, from a development perspective, is we want to make sure that not only are they hitting their goals that they're setting out to meet, but they're also on time in terms of the delivery of that piece of software, whether it's to their customer base, internal stakeholders, or who is ultimately responsible for consuming that piece of software. On the business side of things, it's ensuring that we can not only exceed profitability and productivity, but allow operations to keep that piece of software stable in a runtime environment. So the end goal here is allowing organizations to have the functional skills from dev, from operations, all consolidated within one team, with the end goal of getting to market faster in a much more expedited fashion. So as we think about security, where security has typically kind of been positioned here is within a testing phase, right? We talked about waterfall, we talked about agile, we talked about traditionally where security kind of fits in. And traditionally what we saw is that once development had done their work, it's kicked over to QA to conduct their testing for functional or bug-related issues within the software. That's typically where security came into play. The ultimate goal here from a security perspective is ensure that we're minimizing risk, again, without impacting or slowing down innovation from a development organization standpoint. As I mentioned, Waterfall really introduced the concept of a pre-production check as it related to security. And once dev had completed all the work that they have been set out to adhere to based upon that sprint, then security would come back in and show that issues. So the concern here is that security needs to be baked in throughout the entire process, right? They need to be in the planning phase. So as the product owner is looking through the product backlog, understanding the impact of the changes that development is going to introduce, understanding what is the risk that is potentially going to be exposed there as well. So if we think about, again, a logging functionality, how does that logging functionality impact dev's ability to deliver faster, but also what potential risk comes with that? So if security can be involved in the coding process to say, hey, how you're implementing this input validation isn't necessarily in line with security best practices. So having security awareness and security context baked in as part of that coding phase is not only going to reduce the time to fix potential issues later down the line, but it's also an educational mechanism back to development teams to think more proactively about reducing risk in the context of their DevOps work stream. So as we think about security, right, it has to be baked in throughout the process. It's not just about the testing phase. It's thinking about it from a deployment environment, thinking about it from an operational standpoint, thinking about it from a release phase. What do the configuration of the environments look like, and how does security ultimately come in and help to impact those processes? So now that we've kind of set the stage and set the foundation for various testing methodologies and how security impacts those, what I'd like to do is build upon that to give recommendations or principles that we see as part of securing DevOps pipelines and part of securing DevOps organizations. So the first three principles that we'll focus in on are really focused and narrowed in based upon the pipeline itself. So how do we build upon CI/CD within those pipelines to make sure that security is automated? We want to make sure that we're integrating to fail quickly, and we don't want to introduce any false alarms. As we transition to looking at how we introduce educational concepts at the security champion level, we take security champions and bake them into the development teams that already exist that are working in the context of that DevOps work stream. Additionally, as we transition to looking at production environments, how do we keep operational visibility across the board? So it's not just about the DevOps work stream, but introducing security concepts in the context of that work stream. So as we look at the first principle, we title this automating security. The end goal for security to be as frictionless as possible. Security has to work where development is already working. So whether it's in the development environment, whether it's in the build system, bug tracking, GRC systems, integrating into pre-existing tool chains is going to become increasingly more important for allow for adoption from a security standpoint. Security needs to understand what are the ultimate outcomes of any change that they're looking to implement. So if security comes in and says, yeah, this is fantastic, you can integrate into the development environment or build systems, what is the change of the behavior that we need to alter? In most cases, you're going to see that security's desired outcome is a potential code change, or in other scenarios, it could be a configuration change of a particular environment once that exposure has been identified. In order to achieve this, it's important that development teams, security teams are leveraging good comprehensive APIs. That is a kind of foundational point of any security program, being able to have APIs that plug into those pre-existing solutions that development are already using. Ultimately, it's important to make sure that security allows those changes to be very easy to consume and transparent. So in the context of, let's say we're doing an automated test, we provide the results of an automated test. Maybe it's in a PDF or an Excel spreadsheet back to the development team that was responsible for introducing that risk. You're going to pigeonhole that development team and force them to navigate between a report that was generated by security while looking at their source code. But if we can integrate it into a bug tracking system that development team is already using, right, it makes it much more contextualized. They're used to working that environment within the context of, say, it's a work item within VSTS as an example. If we can give them contextual information pertaining to how the flaw was found, what are recommendations to fix that finding, what are some additional third-party resources that they can go out and look at code snippets, examples on how to implement a fix, and to make the necessary changes to actually reduce the risk overall. So again, the end goal of any security program within the context of DevOps is giving the necessary resources to fix. It's not about finding the issues that's important. It's about being able to reduce the risk and fix those particular findings. So if I circle back to the example that we talked about when kind of laying the foundation with Agile, if we could plug in comprehensive APIs and integrations in as part of the development work stream, allowing development teams to test earlier within the process, it's going to reduce the amount of frustration that your development teams get, rather than, again, with that example I gave, giving them a list of 100 flaws that are introduced, causing a lot of frustration. The second principle here is integrating to fail quickly. So this, again, is a very foundational concept within DevOps. If we are going to run any type of security test, functional test, any type of feasibility test, we need to make sure that if it fails quickly, and we provide that context back to development teams. So this is, again, it's an educational tool that enables development to understand what risk they introduced, what flaws were exposed, and what they can do to actually fix those flaws. So if a dev breaks the build, we have to give them the information to understand why. Why is this important? So within Veracode, the organization that I work for, we're able to measure and track what are some trends across our entire customer base in regards to the risk that they're introducing, and what are some common themes. And what we found actually in 2011 is 32% of all applications contained at least one SQL injection finding. And that's important because in 2017, we found a total of 26% of all applications contained at least one SQL injection. So what's the point, right? The variance or the difference between 2011 and 2017 is only 6 percentage points. So these flaws, these security-related topics are still relevant today, even though they're very old concepts in terms of how to actually fix and implement risk changes associated with the code. So what does that information provide us? Essentially arms us with the ability to keep security top of mind throughout an organization. So the end goal, being able to scan early, being able to scan often, not only allows development teams to essentially understand what risk they're introducing as pre-check-in tests, But the analogy I like to use is it allows them to take the test before they take the exam. So in the graphic here, as we're thinking about iteration through the various, dev work streams, if they're conducting daily releases, as an example, if you allow development teams to run security tests locally prior to check-in, get exposure to the risk they have, when they do ultimately do a check-in of their code for the changes that they've made, that code is going to be clean of any potential risk that they could be exposing. Again, it's still important that you're running security testing at the full build artifact level. We introduced and talked about the concept of feature branch development. In the context of an individual feature branch, there may be risk that is exposed by a developer that they can fix running those localized or unit tests and security tests. But when we start to piece together all the features together, the various microservices as an overall solution to be deployed, there is still potential underlying risk that could be exposed there. Allowing developers to test outside the scope of the pipeline. Again, we talked about those pre-check-in tests. Allow your development teams to go faster. Allow them to get visibility and transparency into the potential risk that they could be exposing. This also introduced the concept of smaller units of code or feature development, as we talked about. Again, looking at how teams are working within the context of a DevOps workflow, kind of siloing features and functionality to individual dev teams to work on, create, innovate, and deliver to market faster, also allows for more scalability, more agile workflows, allowing for security to get visibility in a more expedited fashion. Principle number 3, no false alarms. So this is a really interesting story for me to kind of tell here. So if anybody's keeping up with kind of the latest trending news in the world, right, this is a great false alarm kind of story to paint here. So what happened? I'm coining this or calling this the missile crisis. So Emergency Management Agency of Hawaii basically sent out this notification earlier this month indicating that there's a potential inbound ballistic missile that could hit Hawaii. So what happened? What was the ultimate reaction to this in Hawaii? First of all, people who were driving on the highway that got this notification, I read a number of different articles that talked about people pulling over on the side of the road, getting underneath overpasses to kind of take shelter with kind of the incoming missile taking place. It caused traffic to slow down. In a couple of cases, it actually caused accidents on the highways. Another example that I read was that people were leaving very early in the morning. The notification came about 8 a.m. Standard time for Hawaii, and people were actually leaving their homes to go to shelters. Obviously, the shelters had no anticipation of this and weren't planning, so it really caused a disruption in the Saturday morning routine. So what happened, right? Essentially, what happened was within the Emergency Management Agency, it was a shift change was taking place. And typically when that shift change takes place between those two employees, one employee logs out of the application or the software that they work in throughout the day, and another one logs in. What happened is that employee that was actually logging out, rather than logging out, hit a button to send this particular alarm. And there was not kind of a two-step process to validate the issuing of this particular alert, introducing the false alarm here. So what's the point of that particular story or that example? For any organization, regardless of the technology stacks, regardless of kind of the business purpose, regardless of the functional capabilities of the software and the technology you're delivering to market, people are by far going to be the weakest link in an organization. So by introducing false alarms into a process, we have to think about how that impacts an organization overall. False positives, false alarms, they cost a lot of money to an organization. It's going to frustrate your development teams. It's not going to be able to instill confidence in your development teams. Again, I talked about that example of introducing hundreds of findings into a backlog. If they're introducing all of those findings, development is just going to put their arms up in the air and say, you know what, we're not going to fix anything. We're going to ignore security-related issues. So it's important to find a solution that doesn't introduce a lot of false alarms. We need to instill confidence in development. We need to provide accurate and actionable findings. And ultimately, if you are introducing false alarms or false positives, we could potentially fail the entire pipeline, causing development, DevOps teams as a whole money, but also impacting overall revenue of the organization. So it's extremely important to reduce the amount of false positives and false alarms. The fourth principle is what is known as building security champions. So this is by far one of my favorite principles of the 5 that I've kind of laid out here. So typically with the organizations that I work with, you will see dev will outnumber security by very high ratios. I work with a couple of organizations that have hundreds and thousands of developers with 3 to 4 security team members across the entire organization. Not only are those teams able to identify the assets that they're managing, but actively kind of work with those development teams to secure those particular assets. And the concept here is that security can't be everywhere, right? We need to be able to take the security concepts and security knowledge within the organization and distribute that more broadly across those DevOps organizations. And the way that we do that is through training, right? It's through education. It's sitting down with various development teams to walk them through threat modeling practices, understanding what does the potential risk exposure look like for a given application and how we can be preventative about introducing risk further down the line. It's working with product owners to help them groom the backlog, to understand the impact of the features that they're thinking about within the backlog and how that could potentially impact the overall risk posture of the organization. It's providing code reviews, training on how to conduct code reviews to development teams so they can essentially self-service and give visibility into their peers on what potential risk that they're introducing as they're writing code on a day-to-day basis. As we think about potential types of scenarios or potential security flaws that could be introduced, right? The security team has to be a centralized place of knowledge for those teams. Maybe it's recommendations around how to configure certain technology stacks, how to deploy a particular app server, how to configure that app server. Another example that we've seen actually internally here within my organization is by conducting capture the flag exercises. So essentially what we do is we give our development organization a couple days to sit in a simulated lab and become attackers or hackers in the context of their environment. So spin up a handful of pieces of software, allow our development team to go try and exfiltrate data from those applications with the end goal of giving them the confidence and arming them with the understanding that there's somebody else on the other side of the software that they're building and deploying. Ultimately, with a security champions program, it's extremely important that if the security team is drastically outnumbered by development and the operations folks, that we enable those teams to be successful and we allow for escalations to take place. So put escalation procedures in place, ensure that if somebody does call the security team, if it is centralized, if it's not centralized, that doesn't necessarily matter. But if someone from the organization calls security, make sure we're at their beckoning call. Make sure that you're enabling them to be as pragmatic as possible and consume all the training that you're offering. The final piece is keeping operational visibility. So it's obviously fantastic to be able to secure the pipeline, but we have to think about it beyond just the pipeline, right? So once that code is deployed into a runtime environment, how are we securing production, right? As we think about the pipeline, does production replicate what QA, what staging, what tests, whatever the naming convention is for those various test environments? We have to ensure that those are replicated into a production environment as well. Ultimately, we should also think about how security is running against production environments. So in QA, in stage, in test, if it is replicated, is there prod data there as well? What's the impact of that production data being in those systems? How do we think about what types of tests are going to be relevant for those testing environments as well? And this is where we introduce potential issues like the server configuration that I talked about. Cryptographic issues could be exposed. Credential management issues could be exposed. All could be outside the scope of just securing the pipeline. The other thing to keep in mind here is that those runtime environments are going to change. If you have patch management processes in place across the organization that are going through and updating or changing those environments, the threat landscape and the attack vector is going to change once those patches are in place. So again, security and thinking about securing a DevOps pipeline, think beyond just the pipeline, think about those production environments as well. Also have a set list of metrics and KPIs to measure the success of not only securing the pipeline, but production as well. So, thinking about how much density of code introduce risk within the organization, think about the types of flaws that are being introduced, and then how can we correlate training back to those development teams or operations teams to understand where the risk lies and how we can be preventative about introducing that risk in the future. Obviously, testing locations and culture of testing is going to vary from one organization to the other. Some organizations may say, we're not going to implement security at all until it's in a runtime environment. Again, that's a business decision. That's a cultural decision. And as those decisions get made, you have to weigh how the risk impact overall kind of drives the decisions that are made from security to implement risk reduction activities. So with that being said, what we'd like to do is kind of pose some questions that are definitely thought-provoking that you can take back to the various organizations that you work within. Keeping in mind that DevOps is a journey, right? There's no formal destination indicating that a particular organization has arrived and can be stamped, sealed as a DevOps organization. It's important that you understand how your applications are architected. It's important to understand that all development processes are different, right? A lot of the customers that I work with are still in waterfall phases, and how they secure their waterfall development methodologies are going to be drastically different than how agile teams work. So it's not one size fits all for security within the context of DevOps. Understand how tolerable your organization is to false alarms or false positives, as we talked about. If they are tolerable to them, how do we prioritize that list? If they aren't tolerable to them, what types of best practices and implementations are we taking to empower and educate development to reduce that risk and be preventative about introducing findings in the future? Also, we talked about how will you monitor your applications once they're in production, and being able to take the security expertise that you have in the company and allowing that to be scaled out over time. Again, it's a cultural change. It's a cultural shift. It's not simply, I have the best security experts in the industry working for my company, so I'm good. It's how do you scale that out to make sure that security knowledge is embedded everywhere. And then the final point that we'll kind of highlight here is, what metrics are you thinking about that are measuring success throughout the entire organization? Maybe it's thinking about the types of flaws that are introduced. Maybe it's thinking about the density of flaws per megabyte of code that's being introduced into a runtime environment. Maybe it's thinking about how often analyses are run by individual development teams. Maybe it's thinking about the frequency of testing at the individual pipeline level as well. So with that being said, I just want to thank everybody for your time, and I'll kick it back over to Alan here.
Hey, thanks, Austin. Hey, that was really a great view of really where security and DevOps interact here. First, we have a bunch of questions from the audience. Let me, first of all, answer one that was asked multiple times, and that is the easy one. Will these slides be available? Yes, this webinar was recorded. Excuse me, the recording and the slides will both be available. You look for them on DevOps.com, probably within 24 hours of the webinar. They're also on our YouTube channel at DevOps TV. If you just look up DevOps TV, all one word, on YouTube, you'll find them there. That being said, let us get to some of the questions here from our audience. So Kanan asked, what do you consider under the test? And this is obviously back, Austin, when you were talking about doing testing. If it includes creating test cases, then can it be started as soon as requirements are ready? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a fantastic.
Okay, good.
It does, Alan, absolutely. So, yeah, absolutely. So as we think about unit tests, right, and part of the requirements gathering, as security is baked into requirements gathering, determining if, thinking about what particular requirement impacts the application overall, what does the requirement entail in terms of the changes that the development team needs to make, but just having a security expert in that conversation to think about, what the unit tests entail, what type of data is the unit test interacting with, what type of environment is that unit test kind of invoking that test becomes important. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an individual security professional in those conversations, but having somebody who has kind of a security mindset thinking about how to write those unit tests is absolutely important.
Great. Next question is one, Austin, I want to weigh in on too, but I'm not sure that with the English here, I'll try my best, but does it seem that now when beginning to do DevOps, security should be the number one or the first driver for all development? Well, security people would like to think so, certainly, Austin, right? But we live in a bigger world beyond just security, and I think, part of the issue is we have to realize in security that there are other priorities, there are other factions, there are other needs at play, and security needs have to be blended into all of those. I'm not saying it should be not important. I'm not saying it should be the most important, but it needs to be part of it. And Austin, if you want to chime in on that, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously it's going to be situationally dependent upon the culture of the organization too, right? Most organizations are entering kind of these DevOps methodologies and changes because there's a reason behind it, right? In most scenarios, it's getting their product to market to realize the revenue from that product in a more expedited fashion. Security isn't necessarily driving that conversation. Those are typically board level conversations that are taking place to say, how do we be more innovative and more creative to give our customers a better experience and more functionality in the context of the software that we deliver. In most cases, security is kind of coming in after the fact, but the concept of being able to bake security in as part of those conversations, again, it's not necessarily about having one individual security expert to drive these conversations, but have the organization think about, if we are being that innovative and pushing to market that quickly, what is the potential risk that we're exposing as we do that? So just being diligent as we think about the cultural change that we're implementing.
Got it. Next question was understanding, and again, my English may be wrong here, but understanding the false alarm is neglectable. I'm sure about that. Is there any way to minimize the false alarm in the first place?
Yeah, I think from the customers that I work with, Alan, being able to minimize the false alarm comes down to the technology that you use in first security testing. We talked about continuous improvement, continuous feedback mechanisms in DevOps. It should be the same thing in the security vendor space, right? Being able to take feedback from customers that say, hey, this is a false positive that you found within your analysis. What are you doing to update your solution to ensure that, subsequent analysis after that, we no longer find that issue? So having that continuous feedback mechanism at the security vendor level is obviously important. Additionally, understanding the threat modeling outcome of the applications that you're testing. So, understanding what the overall environment is for a given application. Let's say it's sitting behind a firewall and doesn't handle any customer data or any credit card information, and security team comes in and slaps a PCI policy on it. We start to find issues related to PCI. It's not relevant, right? So keeping in mind, again, the application business purpose, but also working with a security solution that takes feedback from the results of development teams and implements it into the continuous improvement process.
Excellent. Let's go to our next one here. Is there any resource for highlights of how and what people should check or what they should usually check?
Interesting. In terms of the flaws, I guess, yeah, well, let me take a stab at it, Alan. So what we typically recommend for customers that are kind of starting out on the security journey, right, is make it easy and consumable for development teams to get a quick win. Make it easy for your security teams to kind of instill some confidence. And the best way to do that is, identify maybe a set of flaws or a compliance regulation that you want to adhere to. And again, that comes down to the business driver of why security is important to the business. But typically what I see is customers will start with the OWASP top 10 as an example. or they'll start with just SQL injection and cross-site scripting, again, with the end goal of gaining some confidence so they can start to kind of open the scope of the types of flaws that could potentially be introduced around, beyond the initial set of findings that are most important. So starting with like the OWASP top 10 or SQL injection, cross-site scripting, which both roll up to the both roll up to the OWASP top 10 is kind of a good starting point there.
Yep. Next question from Sanket. Which are reliable tools for static code quality checks and the dynamic quality checks?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, from a an organizational perspective, my organization provides both static testing and dynamic testing. I would certainly encourage anyone and everyone to read the Gartner Magic Quadrant, which will help to kind of outline what are solutions in the space, what are the pros and cons that they take to approaching the industry overall. And that'll give you a good idea of vendors that are playing that space.
Yep, excellent. Paras says, automated static scan tools typically generate a lot or many false positives. How do you suggest to handle all these false positives so as to provide focus to development teams?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, something that we would consistently, ask our customers to evaluate what is most important to them. So being able to start off by don't look at the full picture. If there are false positives, that's okay, but being able to work through them is important. Again, finding a solution or vendor that has an acceptable false positive rate, something, below 5% is a fantastic starting point. But if you do have a ton of false positives, depending upon the categorization of the issue, depending upon the impact of that application, will help you to prioritize them. Focus in on the severity and the category of those findings first. If there are false positives in those findings, it's important that the security team understands the implications of those false positives and works with the development teams to prioritize them. But, if you are working with a solution that has a high false positive rate, I would encourage you to kind of look at other solutions that have a much lower false positive rate because, again, it's just going to introduce a lot of frustration to the development process.
Great. Andre asks, what solutions would you recommend for the different security checks throughout the pipeline, especially related to the security check prior to the code commit?
Yeah, great question. So this is actually, again, something that my organization offers as well. We have a solution that within the context of the IDE, development teams can, upon save, invoke an analysis directly associated with maybe it's an individual file or an individual class. So as they're making changes to the code, they can get visibility into the risk of the changes that they've made. And then if they're comfortable with that risk, they can kind of move forward in the process and actually check in their code. So there's solutions out there that, whether it's invoking an API at the repo level, or if it's invoking a test within the individual IDE, that you can get visibility into the risk prior to check-in. So certainly solutions in that space.
Great. Next is a good question from Boris. I'm a one-man DevOps team in my company. Any suggestions on how to start enforcing all of this? Any suggestions of where to start? First of all, Boris, we feel your pain, man. It's got to start somewhere. Austin, what do you suggest for Boris?
Yeah, Boris, keep up the good fight. So I think that the biggest thing is building relationships internally, right? Go sit with a dev team for a week, figure out what their pains are as they work through their backlog, and what type of security training resources you can provide them. And relationships is key. I've certainly seen a number of walls get put up between security and DevOps, but start to create relationships within security and within development to start to push your agenda. And again, it's a journey. It's not a checkbox or a task to accomplish. It's a journey over time. So keep up the good fight, Boris. Thanks for the question.
Yeah. All right. Next question from Ramil. How much time will it take for the security vulnerability test if you build it into your build? I'm thinking of putting the Veracode scan in every build to ensure there's no issue and generate a report.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's obviously, again, situationally dependent upon the application technology stack and how often you're conducting builds. We certainly have customers that are implementing security checks every build. We have customers that are conducting builds on a daily basis. We have customers that are conducting builds every couple minutes, every couple hours. So it's going to be situationally dependent upon your build and release process, but more than happy to sit down and talk in more detail about, what they're doing and how we can help.
Okay. Roar asks, can you comment on how this fits with the test-driven development, respectively behavior-driven development?
You might ask the question one more time, Alan. I had a tough time hearing you.
Sure, Austin. Can you comment on how this fits in with the test-driven development, specifically, I think is what he's looking for, behavior-driven development? Not sure if I know
that's
that.
a good point. Yes, and that really comes down to some of the KPIs and metrics that you can derive from security testing solutions, right? So as we start over time to see trends and the types of security-related issues that are being introduced, to take that information back to the development teams that are responsible for introducing that risk and introduce corrective actions, right? Whether it's training, whether it's understanding the context of the flaws, but anytime that you introduce a security testing solution, allowing the dev teams to get exposure to that test, so the test is the same every single time, it's going to become a reinforcement educational solution. So it's focusing the testing at the individual dev level, but also, again, at the full build artifact level, where we can start to build out what are some trends, what are some metrics that we can take back to the business and implement changes based upon the risk that we're exposing.
Sure. So Sanket asks, do you have tools like Cucumber, for instance, which can be used for acceptance testing, and then get some tools in the back end for security?
Yeah, so as I understand Cucumber, very similar to the likes of Chef or like Circle CI, as you think about the test that you're conducting from those environments, being able to take the APIs into the security solutions and invoke them is perfectly acceptable and pretty commonplace in the customers that we work with. So having, a command line interface step within those tools to invoke an analysis as part of the build process makes it pretty easy to kind of kick off an analysis and consume the findings.
Great. So next question is one, Austin, I'm going to jump on with you on this, and it's from Somish. Wants to know, if security expertise is being brought into DevOps, what happens with SecOps? And that's an interesting question that I deal with a lot, Austin, in talking to people, and I've done several panels, and I'm doing a webinar for the RSA conference folks on this. And that is, what is the role of the security person within this DevSecOps kind of, framework, right? So if security is everyone's responsibility, what is the role of the security team and the security person and the security ops team? Well, certainly they don't go away, certainly they play a key role in things. But I think what they have to do is, they have to sort of lead the charge in terms of what are the security tools to be using, right? And play a significant role in picking those tools. Number two, I think, as you mentioned, they need to be embedded into DevOps, into cross-functional teams that include both developers and ops folks. And, and unfortunately, as Austin, you mentioned, there's a lot more developers usually than there are security folks. And so these security folks have to be parceled out, but they need to become part of the team. They need to become part of the process, of the framework. They don't disappear, but standing off as a bolt-on after the fact, saying no, that's not going to work anymore, right? Security people need to become part of. So what happens to SecOps? They become DevSecOps, and that's these cross-functional teams that I think rule the day. Austin, you can chime in.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there, Alan, right? As I think about security operations, there's always going to be a time and place for that expertise. As we bake in security into development and DevOps teams overall, they can only go so far, right? And that's why we talked about that escalation process you have a day-to-day job as a developer to innovate, create, and build awesome code. You may not have the deep underlying security expertise. There's going to be different levels of capability as it relates to that domain. As I think about security operations, that's still going to be valuable. We talked about operational visibility. I think about organizations that I work with who are running vulnerability management solutions that are monitoring what their production environments look like and where risk is exposed. A DevOps team isn't going to do that, right? So there's absolutely still going to be time and place for those, true security experts that can continue to kind of elevate themselves within the organization and build the relationships with those DevOps teams.
Sure. Austin, next, Amit came back with our minimize false alarms regarding that answer. And he said, minimizing false alarms, isn't this a compromise while automating? What precautions are to be taken care of while suppressing these alarms?
That's a great question. Yeah, so there's always going to be a balance between, time to get results and, quality of results. And again, that comes down to kind of a cultural and a business decision. False positives are certainly something that every organization is going to have to deal with in some capacity. But again, it's going to be situationally dependent upon the risk of the application. So one thing that I do with my customers is go through, understand their full asset inventory. From that asset inventory, determine, what is the confidentiality, integrity, availability, impact of each application? What's the criticality of that application overall? And that will start to give you the ability to understand what is your tolerance for false positives within those pieces of software. If it's an internal application that doesn't handle a lot of confidential information, false positive there is probably more acceptable than a production-facing application that handles customer data. So, again, it's not one size fits all. Automated tools, you are going to run into some false positives, but it's getting to a level that the organization is comfortable with to be able to analyze those issues and apply compensating or changes to the code to reduce that risk.
Got it. Next, Stefan asked, how is DevOps different or similar to what you've presented? Go ahead, Austin. It was your presentation, so I'll let you answer.
Yeah, so that's a pretty broad question, but in terms of what I presented, right, my focal point was coming to approach DevOps from a security perspective, right? How do you bake DevOps into the context of what security should be thinking about and where they should be allocating their time and resources to reduce risk overall. What I intended to do is kind of set out the foundation and baseline on how we arrive at DevOps and how we take this journey in stride with a security lens kind of in mind. So again, there's no nirvana of DevOps being implemented within an organization. It's a long-term process, a long-term change with the end goal of being adaptive, innovative, and allowing your organization to deliver to market in a more expedited fashion. But again, keeping security top of mind as we do that.
Got it. Next, from Paras, there are tools available for threat modeling, static, dynamic scans, etc. Any specific tool, Austin, that you would suggest to bake security during requirements phase?
Yeah, so something we kind of similar question to a previous question. During the requirements phase, it's important to understand what's the end goal or business function of that particular piece of software. Go through, do your threat modeling, understand where the risk is exposed. More oftentimes than not, there's either tools in the space or consulting engagement services that allow you to be as pragmatic and practical within those processes. Again, I would recommend looking at Gartner to understand who are the leaders in the space and where other organizations are thinking.
Okie dokie. Next. Okay, so Austin, and we only have, this might be the last question here. What DevSecOps, what should we do in the case of an organization that doesn't have any kind of special security team? Who should take care about the security test? Who kind of owns it? Is there any recommendation best practices?
Yeah, Yeah. Well, I think, like any organizational change, it starts small. So maybe it's a dev manager that decides to take some security training and then trains up their respective development teams to start to look at what potential issues they could expose. And, it may not necessarily be that you have a centralized security team, but the concept of security in an organization is becoming a board level discussion. You look at recent breaches in the news, you look at the organizations that are impacted, you look at the revenue impact, you look at the PR and the marketing impact. How could that potentially affect your company? And then who are the decision makers to think about potentially hiring a security guru? If you're not going to hire somebody, take some onus on yourself to get trained up on security practices and how it impacts your day-to-day workflow, and then train your colleagues. So again, it's not we have a security team, we're good, we're buttoned up, we're never going to be exposed to risk. It's a journey, it's a process.
Absolutely. Austin, we are past our top of the hour. I apologize. We have a bunch more emails, including people who want your emails so they can ask you. We have a bunch more questions, including people who want your email to ask you even more questions. I don't know if we want to publish that right now. But we do have a record. We have all these questions in writing, Austin. We'll get them to you, and you can respond to them on your time and
awesome
any way you can. But hey, man, that was a fantastic webinar. I appreciate you doing it with the cold and fighting through. You're a pro. Love to have you back on. To everyone who sat in on this, our first official Security Boulevard webinar, thanks for joining us, everyone. I hope to see you soon on another DevOps or Security Boulevard webinar. This is Alan Schimmel. Have a great day. Bye-bye.